Ladies and gentlemen, two girls, two boys, a phenomenon in pop music. ABBA.
Hello and welcome to this very special episode of Like a Magic Spell. We're not back with a new season just yet. This is an interview that I did recently with the author and Swedish music guru, Jan Gradvall. He's written a new book called The Book of ABBA, Melancholy Undercover. As I said to Jan during the interview, I've read other ABBA books in my time, but they often follow a chronological pattern. However, the reason this book stands out for me is because it really sets the context in which ABBA made their music, the particularly Swedish things which influenced them in creating their music. It talks about the political context, it talks about the cultural context, it talks about the interpersonal relationships, as you would imagine, between the ABBA members. And it was great to sit down on Zoom with Jan recently. Before we get to the actual meat of the interview, I just want to say something about ABBA Voyage. Now, in all of the episodes I've done so far, I have resisted the urge to talk about ABBA Voyage and the content of the actual show. In fact, I've sometimes had to edit out quite large chunks of the chats because we've talked in detail about ABBA Voyage. So what I'm going to do is, around about 19 minutes into the interview, I'll pop back and say, here's your Voyage spoiler. We don't give too much away, but we do talk about the first 3 songs that you hear at the ABBA Voyage show. So if you don't want to hear that, just wait for me to come and tell you. You'll have to skip ahead about 90 seconds before normal service is resumed. There is another very brief mention at the very, very end, which on reflection was hard to edit out. But anyway, if you don't want to know what happens in ABBA Voyage, then wait until I pop back and then fast forward 90 seconds. So the book itself starts with a really fascinating chapter on the day before you came. So I began by asking Jan why he started it there.
It makes no sense really that I should start there, but I think that moment in ABBA's career, I always thought about that, and I love that song. And I think that song captures the title of the book as well. That quote Benny said to me that even the happiest songs are melancholic. As its core, we did Melancholy Undercover. And that's very obvious in this song. It really captures that. And I always thought of that as a good beginning. When I did that first chapter, I didn't know about the reunion with Voyage, really. But I sort of kept it as the way I planned to do.
On my podcast, we go through the songs and we give them marks out of 10. And I gave The Winner Takes It All 9 out of 10. And somebody said to me, well, what gets 10 out of 10? And I said, well, the day before you came.
Excellent, yeah.
You mentioned several things in the book that perhaps a non-Swedish reader might not readily understand. You talk about, for example, the music styles raggare, if that's correct, and dance bands.
Yeah.
How important were these musical phenomena, these particularly Swedish musical phenomenons to the music of ABBA?
I think a dance band, for instance, that's a very unique tradition in Sweden where you have live bands. It's still operative, play mostly in small cities, and people go to dance to those live bands. And they play like a mix of old and new cover songs. And it's very important that the songs have a very distinct beat so you can dance to them. And this has been going on in Sweden since like the 40s. The way the music of dance bands sound has varied. But when they started, both Agneta and Frida were singing in dance orchestras or dance band when they were like 14, 15, way too early, really. So that's how they learned their craft, by singing like 3 or 4 hours every night, a little bit like their version of the Beatles in Hamburg, I think. And that's sort of the culture also, that the most important thing is the audience, not yourself. You're there to serve the audience, which has also always been a thing in ABBA. There's no egos in the music, really. The focus is on the audience. And Björn and Benny at the same time, when they were all pop stars in Sweden at the 60s, in the 60s separately. So when ABBA started, they were unknown in the world, but in Sweden they were seen as like a supergroup. Two of the most famous bands in Sweden, one was Hootenanny Singers, who did the folk rock with Björn Ulvaeus as the lead singer. They toured endlessly at these places called the People's Park, Folkets Park, where they had dance bands playing all the time. And the other band was a tougher version called Hepstars, where Benny Andersson was the keyboard player, the youngest member of the band, very energetic on stage. And Hepstars really appealed to this subculture in Sweden called raggare. It's a bit like rockers, greasers in a way, people who are driving around in American cars, dresses like Elvis Presley or Eddie Cochran. And Hepstars looked more like the Stones or the Beatles, but their music really appealed to this raggare subculture. The biggest hit was a cover of a song called Cadillac, and they drove around in Swedish small towns in their American cars, and they were huge stars. Agneta told me that she was one of the fans, sort of waiting outside when they played, and wanted to get their autographs on her denim jacket. But Benny didn't show up. But I think being a Swede, I think if you're going to write a book about the Beatles, for instance, it probably is quite difficult if you're not from England, because you sort of understand their humor, their references. And I think it's a little bit the same with ABBA. That's why I decided to write the book. I think being a Swede, I sort of know where they come from. I've seen the same TV programs, I've listened to the same folk music, read the same poets. So I tried to explain that in the book.
You set ABBA's music in that very important musical and political context of the 60s and the 70s, particularly the political context from the late 60s onwards. What made ABBA stand out within Swedish society in those times?
Sweden at that time, in the 60s and 70s, was a very unusual country, since Sweden is a very small country with only 8 million people then, now 10 million, speaking a language no one else understands. And it was situated right between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. And we had a social democratic government. We were a neutral country, not a member of NATO. And the culture in Sweden was very left-wing, especially in the 70s. People who had power of what songs should be played on television and radio were very left-wing, much more left-wing than Social Democrats. And they said that the music we should play should be in Swedish. The lyrics should preach for a better society, a socialist society. And for them, when ABBA came, winning Eurovision, which they hated, and ABBA made money, they started singing in English, which was not popular. So they really hated ABBA and made ABBA their enemy, which must be very difficult to understand if you're from another country in the Western world. But I think ABBA was very loved by the people. The newspapers trashed them in reviews, the radio didn't want to play them, the television was very negative. But I think in the country, in Sweden at that time, people really listened to dance bands and ABBA and heavy metal. Those three were sort of the people's music. But in the Eastern Bloc, those countries realized is that the populations love pop music. We don't want anything to do with the Western world, but I guess we have to let in a little bit of pop music to keep the citizens calm, sort of. And then they decided they didn't want any American bands or British bands, But I thought this band from the Social Democratic Sweden, they fit perfectly into this. So countries like Eastern Germany, Poland, Russia, or the Soviet Union, as it's called, they sort of bought ABBA records. And Poland in 1976, the whole budget for Western culture, they used at buying the Arrival album by ABBA. So ABBA is still huge in those countries. And when you visit the ABBA Museum in Stockholm, there's a lot of people from Eastern Europe because they looked at ABBA as their band, sort of the Western band they loved. Meanwhile, ABBA was hated in Sweden because they were called capitalists. So they call capitalists in Sweden and socialists in the Eastern world. And hopefully, like in England, just very good pop band.
Yes. And actually, I think as you and I speak today, it is actually one of the anniversaries of them filming one of their Poland TV special.
No, I actually went to Warsaw this spring because the book has been translated into Polish. Poland was one of the first countries to translate the books. And I even appeared on morning television in Poland. And all thanks to this ABBA special in 74, I think, yeah.
I suppose nowadays the music is universal, but I suppose you can tell which countries ABBA is popular in by the languages into which your books are translated.
Yes, actually, yeah. I think the three countries where ABBA were the biggest were Australia, number one, the UK, number two, Netherlands maybe number three, and I guess Poland is up there, maybe number four or something like that.
I think there's a fascinating story to tell, not today, but there's a fascinating story to tell about ABBA's success in Australia, how it was so huge, but then it seemed to just dip. It fell away, but then it was revived, with Muriel's wedding and all those things. But that's a separate story. But
and I think it's an anniversary for Muriel's wedding also.
It is, yes.
Yes.
What's that? 30 years?
Yeah, 30 years. Yeah, this autumn. Yeah.
Goodness me, what a movie! That is so incredible. I like how Benny and Bjorn put their stamp of approval on the script when they read the script, because they said it was an underdog story of someone triumphing, using ABBA's music to help them on their way. I think it's just a fascinating story and a fascinating kind of concept.
Yeah, I think they were known to say no to everything. They said yes to very few things regarding movies and TV series, but they said yes to those two Australian movies. But they said yes to Muriel's Wedding and Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, which has been very important in creating the revival of ABBA in the early 90s, because ABBA was sort of out in the cold after The Day Before It Came and Under Attack sort of flopped. They didn't do anything for 10 years. And then suddenly they started a revival in the early 90s. Kurt Cobain started talking about ABBA. U2 invited Björn and Benny on stage. And especially in the gay community in Australia and Sydney, they sort of started this ABBA as their band. Erasure with the ABBA-esque EP also was very important creating this revival.
There's a section in the book where you talk about U2 and Benny and Bjorn being invited on stage, but they weren't sure whether they should do it because they weren't sure if they were going to be made fun of, which is extraordinary, isn't it?
I was there in the audience. We didn't know anything about this. I was there as a U2 fan. And I was also, of course, a huge ABBA fan. And I guess the others in the audience weren't really, because ABBA weren't considered cool. And you could feel like in hesitations for a few seconds when they introduced Björn and Benny. Here they are. But then after like 5 seconds, everyone realized this is the best song ever written. This is fantastic. But they were quite brave, U2, in doing that, I think. And I think U2 didn't realize what experience ABBA had in Sweden, that they were not considered like a cool band or even a good band. So I think that was an important thing for ABBA as well.
I'm taking advantage of the fact that you are the first proper Swedish person I've had on my podcast, because I often talk about the uncool 80s. Was that the same in Sweden? Because my perception as a British person is that they were not very cool. And then, as you've mentioned, these little things started coming around again in 1992, etc. Was it the same? Was it the same in Sweden, that sort of that uncool decade?
At that time, it wasn't considered uncool, but in retrospect, it was. But nowadays, with younger people in their 20s, they love the 80s. And I think people have realized now that it was very, if we listen to pop music, I guess it's difficult to beat the 60s. But I think the 80s is a contender for being so innovative with synthesizers, creating radical new sounds every week. And I think those bands have really stood the test of times. Like I bought a ticket for Human League and going to see them in Stockholm soon. And they're still surfing on that 80s wave. But I think there was so much good music made. And as I write in the book, a lot of those bands were very influenced by ABBA, the old synth pop movement from the Human League onward to the Pet Shop Boys. If you listen to the Pet Shop Boys, the combination of electronics and really melancholic melodies with those almost deadpan way of singing, it's very much The Day Before It Came by ABBA.
Talking about that 1992, 93 Renaissance period, one thing I learned from your book yesterday was actually the Swedish economic and political context of that time was very different to a decade before. I'm thinking of the assassination of Olof Palme, and the sort of loss of innocence, and also the economic downturn at the start of the 90s. So it's a very strange juxtaposition, isn't it, between the slight dip in Swedish economic fortunes and the renaissance of ABBA.
Yeah, because when Sweden were at its lowest, the rise of ABBA began again, which is quite odd, really. But I think Olof Palme is still a big shock in Sweden. Our prime minister was assassinated on the street. Benny Andersson did the score for a TV series about the Olof Palme murder. And I did an interview with him the other week for his current project called Benny Andersson Orchestra, which is a lot of folk music, all kinds of music. And then he played me a little bit of music he has made for an upcoming series in Sweden about Sweden's role during the Second World War. In Sweden, Benny Andersson is really seen as the composer. We don't have anything like Finland have Sibelius, Norway have Grieg, we have Benny Andersson. If you will do something about Swedish history, he's the first person you will try to persuade to do it.
That's fascinating. And I think when I finished the book, I'm not sure if it's fair to say that Benny's influence is more than the other members, but his knowledge of the music and the folk traditions and the accordion and all of these things really stands out, doesn't it?
Yeah, and Benny wrote all the melodies, really. So he's the composer. That was important thing for me, that I really put the focus also on Agneta and Frida, because they very rarely give interviews. The focus in recent time have been on Björn and Benny, because they are sort of the public faces of ABBA. But when I asked them all four individually, what's the secret behind ABBA's sound, sort of the secret sauce, they all four say that it's the combination of Agneta and Frida's voices. Agneta has this very clear soprano voice. Frida is more mezzo. She has to struggle a little bit to get up to Agneta's notes. And that combination, when they sing in unison, you can hear kilometers away that you're listening to ABBA and ABBA only. No one can buy that sound. And Agneta and Frida were very much involved in creating that. They loved being in the studio. Agneta didn't like touring, but she loved being in the studio, doing endless takes to get that very special ABBA sound. And on the Swedish cover of the book, it's actually only a photograph of Agneta and Frida only. There's been so many other photographs, but I thought their tight connections were really what created ABBA. But you're totally right. I mean, Benny Andersson's melodies is the foundation of ABBA.
I was also struck as well that you also mentioned how birds actually have a strong through line through ABBA's work. I mean, even one of the working titles for The Day Before You Came was The Bird with the Broken Wing.
Yeah.
I was just wondering about how the Sweden's natural environment has also influenced their music.
I think Sweden is similar to Great Britain in that way. I visited Liverpool this spring for the first time ever. And you can go to the childhood homes of Paul McCartney and John Lennon, which is now opened by National Trust, I think.
Yes.
That was exactly when I had finished writing the book. But they have recreated Paul McCartney's bedroom with some posters, record sleeves, and 2 books lying by his bed. One was John Osborne, Look Back in Anger. And the other one was the Book of British Birds.
Wow.
And you can hear in Paul McCartney's music, of course, Blackbird and other examples.
Yes.
And there's definitely a connection in the melodies between Paul McCartney and Benny Andersson. Sweden is a very large country in the area, but quite few people in it. So it's a lot of areas with nature. And all 4 of them love walking around in nature. So that has definitely coming into the music. In the early 90s, when there's been nothing new about ABBA for 10 years, there was a rumor that Benny was working on a solo project. And I know internationally this really spread. Everyone was like, what is Benny Andersson doing? And it turned out for 2 years, he had worked on this CD documenting the bird songs of all the Swedish birds. So that turned out to be his new project. He did this double CD documenting all Swedish birds singing. And in Sweden, that became a hit too. It sold a lot. So it was a platinum record because it was Benny documenting birdsong.
This is your ABBA Voyage spoiler alert. If you don't want to hear what the first 3 songs played at the ABBA Voyage show are, then fast forward around about 80 or 90 seconds to avoid spoilers. And also, I noticed, again, something else I learned from the book was Benny's track Skalgong.
Yeah.
That's played at the start of ABBA Voyage. And again, it's folk tradition. It's very sort of natural. And you're looking at a forest. You're looking at the sun going down in a forest.
Yeah.
It's very powerful and natural, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think if you're an ABBA fan, you might expect something like that. But if you come from the outside and think of this, the ABBA Voyage is really like a celebration, a party. Some people might be shocked by that because it's so dark and melancholic. It's black and white. It's more like in the tradition of Ingmar Bergman, maybe. But that's very typical of ABBA.
Yes, I think I've been 4 times now, and sometimes the people I've gone with are surprised at the tracks. For example, starting with The Visitors and then Hole in Your Soul, I think it's Hole in Your Soul second. But people are surprised by that, and I say, well, of course, that's ABBA. Yeah. They don't want to just give you everything that you want on a plate.
No, I love that because Visitors was one of those songs they never had the chance to play live. They had stopped playing live before The Visitors came out. And that's in the tradition of ABBA doing the things they want to do, not to please the people only.
And talking of ABBA Voyage, and this is quite a big question, I admit, what's the future for ABBA? Can you see a situation in which there are voyages popping up all over the world?
There will never be a reunion of ABBA. Some people think this was a start. Maybe they will all appear on stage. They will never do that. But I know they're trying to open more concert music like ABBA Voyage in different countries. So I think it's quite likely that you will see one in Australia, one in somewhere in Asia, and one in Las Vegas. So that's at least they're trying to do that. But I think the one in London will go on for a long, long time. And maybe we get to a point where you can actually see ABBA perform all over the world at the same time as the avatars, while sitting at home, eating dinner, listening to bird song. So, which I think they love. That really suits them.
And they've always done their own thing, haven't they? They've always. It seems like they've never well, maybe not never. They rarely compromise themselves and their artistic value.
Yeah, but I think they will admit that they were quite lost in the 80s. They did that very unwise decision of selling their music rights, which they shouldn't have done. And they weren't a part of this revival at all. It was created by other persons. And there was one guy at the record company in the UK who did the ABBA Gold compilation. ABBA had nothing to do with that. And that has been crucial for the ABBA revival. Most younger people, younger generations see that as sort of the ABBA album. And I think it's interesting because now ABBA has nothing to do with nostalgia, really. Most people are ABBA fans today, weren't even born when they were active. And maybe one reason, I think the songs, if you listen to fantastic songs now from the 60s or 70s or the 80s, you can sort of hear in what decade the song was made. But it's difficult with ABBA. If you listen to The Winner Takes It All or Dancing Queen, they don't sound like 70s songs or early 80s songs. They weren't really a part of that time when they were made. And they still aren't a part of the time, really. I guess they were influenced by English and American pop music, but also by a lot of European music like German Schlager, Swedish folk music, French chansons, Italian arias. So their sound, they really had a unique sound.
I was watching a documentary about Chess, the musical, recently. And in that, I think it was Bjorn who said, our music is very European and we are proud of that. And that was quite a striking thing to say, I thought. I think, I've said on the podcast before that Chess is just, I think Chess is incredible as a sort of any evolution of ABBA's work.
But I think they were a little hurt that Chess wasn't really a hit, but the songs are fantastic. And Benny also said that, which I write about in the book, when they were invited into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, he held this thank you speech where he really said that the sound of ABBA was a product of the Swedish radio, the public service radio he grew up with, where you quite rarely heard pop music. You really heard opera, schlagers, march music, folk music, and all those influences melt together and sort of become ABBA.
Well, I have to say, it's a fantastic book, Jan. It's a really riveting read. And what I like about it as well is I've read other ABBA biographies, which is very chronological, but this doesn't necessarily stick to that structure. You get the feeling that the chapters are important in their own mind. So it's a thoroughly brilliant book. Thank you for writing it.
That means a lot to hear. That means a lot, really. And I thought I wasn't that interested in writing a chronological book. And maybe that I'm very glad that you picked up about this first chapter, which is quite odd in a way to start with the end. But that sort of very sort of black and white atmosphere, maybe that's a little bit like the ABBA Voyage with the Skull Gone song that you don't start where people expect you to start, really.
Well, Jan, thank you so much. I'll let you go because I know you're very busy probably because you're coming to the UK, aren't you, for a bit of a book tour?
Yeah, in the end of October for London, Sheffield and Glasgow.
Thank you so much, Anna. Really, really very much appreciate it. It's great to talk to you.
It's a real pleasure talking to you. Thanks a lot.
Huge thanks to Jan for his time and also to Hannah from Faber for helping to organise our chat over Zoom. As Jan mentioned, he is doing a bit of a mini book tour around the UK. The dates are Wednesday the 23rd of October in London. That's at Waterstones in Piccadilly. And apparently that's with Ana Matronic and performances from the ABBA Tribute Band. The following day, Thursday 24th of October, Jan is in Sheffield at the Off the Shelf Festival. And that's with Daniel Dillon Wray, plus an ABBA and Eurovision quiz. And finally, on Friday the 20th 25th of October. Jan is at Waterstones in Glasgow with Gemma Cairney, and the blurb says, "Come dressed in your finest ABBA outfits." So I will be looking forward to seeing pictures of those on the gram. As always, if you want to get in touch with me, it's likeamagic_spell@gmail.com or at likeamagic_spell on Instagram. I'll be back soon with news of the next season of the podcast. But in the meantime, bye-bye. Like a Magic Spell is presented and produced by me, Adrian Stirrup. The theme was composed and performed by Ian Jones. Ian, thank you for the music.